Hello, everyone, and welcome to May University of Washington Seattle Children's Grand Rounds. I'm Carol Rockhill, one of the organizers, along with Michelle Kuhn. We want to start with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and that we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. And we know that this acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but does serve as one way to honor the land we're on and resist cultural erasure. We also acknowledge that this country exists and prospered as a result of the free enslaved labor of Black people. We honor the legacy of the African diaspora and Black life, knowledge and skills that have been stolen due to violence and systemic oppression. And we affirm our commitment to be aware of our own privilege and of oppression and how they play a role in the lives of our patients, families, and employees as we strive to be anti-racist and improve care for those with less privilege. I also want to point out that May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and also is Jewish American Heritage Month and Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So we have a lot to celebrate this month. I have a couple of quick announcements. One is apologies that we had a lot of Grand Rounds invites this month. We're figuring that out and promise to try not to overwhelm your inbox as much next month. And next month is a special Grand Rounds where our Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellows will be presenting their scholarly inquiry projects, the graduating fellows. And that will be all virtual and will extend to 10 a.m. So I wanted to make sure people were aware of that. Typically, June is our final Grand Rounds of the series, and we start again in October, but we are going to have an August Grand Rounds session so that our postdoctoral fellows can present their research and clinical projects that they have completed during their postdoc time. Without further ado, I'm going to hand off to Nat Youngbluth and China Bolden, who are both part of our Seattle Children's professional family and of the Metzger professional family.
Good morning, everyone. I am China Bolden Jarvis, and I am a postdoctoral fellow, and I am very excited and honored to be able to be here this morning and introduce Dr. Metzger to you all. Dr. Metzger is a licensed clinical psychologist and assistant professor at Georgia State University. She's also an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Georgia and affiliate research faculty at Yale University School of Public Health. She is the director of the Empower Lab and owner of Cultural Concepts. Dr. Metzger received her doctorate from the University of South Carolina and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the Medical University of South Carolina and Yale University. It would take most of our Grand Rounds time for me to name all of the awards and honors that Dr. Metzger has received. And a few that stand out to me are the APA Distinguished Scholar Distinction, a research award in recognition of creativity and leadership on research studies that contribute meaningfully to clinical science, ABCT's Francis C. Sumner Excellence Award in recognition of innovative health disparities research, and an Early Career APA Award for outstanding contribution to trauma psychology. Dr. Metzger is prolific in her generation of impactful academic papers, trainings, and public-facing mental health resources, including her recently published implementation manual, Integrating Trauma-Focused Cognitive Behavioral Therapy and Racial Socialization for Black Youth and Families. And of course, she's a generous mentor and collaborator. And during my year at UW and Seattle Children's Hospital as a clinical psychology resident, I, along with Dr. Rochelle Clifton, who was another resident at the time, we were fortunate to be able to pilot a racial stress and coping group for Black youth here at the hospital. And it was Dr. Metzger's work that we leaned on and her generous giving of materials and resources that allowed us to design curriculum for that group. Dr. Metzger has been an inspiration for me personally and countless others, and she generously gives her time and expertise to build up scientists and a future generation of competent clinicians and researchers. I'll pass it over to Nat.
Thank you, China. Dr. Metzger's work has helped to shift the field's understanding of racial stress and trauma and has given us clear and practical strategies that we can use to better address the needs of youth and families of color. And this has had a big impact here in Washington State, where the ideas developed by Dr. Metzger and her colleagues have influenced how we train hundreds of providers annually in the publicly funded CBT Plus, FAST, and CETA training initiatives. Dr. Metzger joined us to lead a workshop for CBT Plus in 2021, and it was wildly popular. And she's worked closely with our team to develop a number of CBT Plus and FAST treatment resources that are now used widely for treatment engagement, for boosting cultural responsiveness, and to help treat the impacts of racial stress and trauma. And she has a unique talent for distilling emerging knowledge and best practices for clinicians and for the public. And she's been prolific in her contributions to the academic literature, but also to the public through handouts, flyers, infographics, public health campaigns, and podcasts. So I hope, like me, you'll enjoy drafting off of Dr. Metzger's infectious passion, warmth, and humor to better serve the families and communities in your care. I'll turn it over to Dr. Metzger.
You guys, that was the best introduction. I should have recorded that personally. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for having me today. And it's early where you are as well. So thank you for coming so early to hear me talk about racism, which sucks. But hopefully what you'll walk away with is really feeling empowered to, within whatever your professional role is, whether you're a graduate student, whether you are an intern or even some faculty members, if you're a supervisor, hopefully you'll walk away feeling empowered to help Black youth and families heal from interpersonal and racial trauma within your respective role. So we only have an hour together for me to do this presentation. I'm going to try to run through some of the more tedious stuff like this. So disclosures, I have no conflicts to disclose. If I say anything that you disagree with, do not contact the NIH or SAMHSA, just contact me and we will be able to talk about whatever your concerns are. For the hour that we have here together today, I'm going to start off with a very brief introduction because Nat and China just did so great at introducing me. Then I'm going to jump into some background information on interpersonal and racial stress and trauma and the ways in which those impact Black youth. Like I said, I do want to take a strengths-based approach. I do want us to walk away really understanding the process of racial socialization and the ways in which that serves as a resilience-boosting process for Black youth and families. I will discuss some of my research. I'll give you an overview, but I do want to focus on some community-based participatory research that talks about things that organizations can do to increase access to service utilization for Black youth and families. And then I will leave you with 4 strategies and a bunch of resources that hopefully over the next month, the next years, throughout your clinical work, you will start using in your work with Black youth and families. And then I think we're going to be pretty strict on time so that we have, 15 minutes for question and discussions at the end. So, we have a chat for you guys to use. We have some lovely moderators in the room. So please, please, please use the chat to contribute to the discussion. I'm going to have a couple moments when I want you guys to reflect, but certainly there might be some times where you have some questions that you want to ask, where maybe you even potentially feel uncomfortable. I encourage you to use the chat for those instances as well. And like I said, we will be able to, at the end of this, spend some time discussing those questions. If during your reflections, if in your questions you have any clients that you want to ask questions about, don't use any identifying information. If you have any personal experiences that you want to share, please feel free to do that. I just ask the rest of the audience and other participants to respect the privacy and confidentiality of each other. Let's share resources. Let's not share any private information. Speaking of resources, there's a ton of them. They're going to be available for you at draishametzger.com. I will orient those to you at the end of today. And don't worry, I'm not selling anything. All these resources are free. Many of them are funded by those researchers or those funding agencies that I talked about earlier. So 16 readings. You guys are all at a hospital. I have 16 recommended readings for you. They are all downloaded and ready for you to read. If you go to draishametzger.com and you look under the racial trauma trainings, you can download all these PDFs and read them in your free time that I'm sure you have a ton of, right? So, like I said, I'm going to skip the professional part of my introduction and really talk about kind of the me search, right? The me that goes into the research that I do, and really the why behind the work that I do. So I'm from Sierra Leone, West Africa. We are known for 7 of the world's most beautiful beaches. We're also, I would say, more infamously known for a civil war that took place in the 80s. It was actually about 20 years long if you think about the civil unrest and the reconstruction that took place afterwards. But certainly the Civil War in Sierra Leone was perhaps most infamously known not only for the diamond trade that in some ways incited the Civil War, but certainly for the use of child soldiers that the rebel army employed. And this was due to coercion, drugging, raping, threatening, amputating the limbs of elders in the community. And if you can imagine, just based on that very brief description, it was very traumatizing for youth in Sierra Leone. For those of us who were fortunate enough, many people were refugees to neighboring countries like Liberia and Guinea. Some of my family, however, came to the United States. So I grew up in College Park, Georgia, where, as you can see, some of us on the screen, there were up to 14 of us in the same house at one point. But in terms of my early experiences, I always say that I didn't really form true relationships with white people until elementary school. So these kind of interpersonal relationships certainly were marked by what you see on the screen here, these kind of lighthearted jokes that were told that certainly had an impact on my identity and my development in a way to which I later realized I was experiencing microaggressions and forms of interpersonal racism, even in these early school experiences. Institutionally, I was also almost placed in special ed in the 4th grade. Luckily, I had a dad who was advocating for me and who was willing to come up to the school and to really make sure that my teachers and administrators were aware of maybe some cultural disconnects that I was having or problems code switching, but certainly there wasn't any intellectual difficulties or problems with vocabulary acquisition. In terms of me search and research, I now know that Black kids are more likely to be referred to special education for behavioral problems and cultural disconnects and even implicit biases and institutional policies and practices that lead them to be more unfairly disciplined as well. So kind of this understanding of racial trauma and racial stressors has contributed to the research that I do and the work that I do, but so has the experiences that I had with socialization early on. So I talked about my dad coming up to the school and advocating for me. He also started an organization called League that allowed me to put on plays and pound fufu and cook traditional meals and really just stay connected to my heritage and my culture back home. He did this very intentionally. When we were in school, for example, reading American history books, he made sure that I read African history books. So he was going through this process to really make sure that I had representation when necessary, that I had examples to combat negative experiences that I would encounter in the real world. And all of those kind of negative experiences, as well as the coping processes that I was fortunate enough to learn from in my family, did contribute to my program of research in graduate school. I'll spare you from the actual academic trajectory, as like I said, that was a great introduction that I received earlier. And what I will say is that currently I'm at Georgia State University, where I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I am certified in TFCBT in the provision of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. I do focus on the integration of culture and the understanding of racism and racial socialization into the work that I do. I do that not only on the individual level, but also as a supervisor of graduate students and as a trainer to clinicians in the community. That's mainly because I do want to really just increase the capacity of not only myself, but other clinicians around the nation to help Black youth heal from these experiences that they have with interpersonal stressors and even those racial stressors that they're likely to encounter. This is because also a new addition to my introduction is that I just had a little baby boy in December, and that does, thank you for the hearts, that does contribute to the personal reasons behind my why, the passion for doing this work and really making sure that all the Black boys and Black girls who are growing up in today's society have the skills and the coping mechanisms and even the family support to navigate racism, as we also, right, are working behind the scenes and hopefully on the forefront to help eradicate racism. So with that, I do encourage you all, like I said, if you don't know each other, there's 170 of you in here. Introduce yourselves, but certainly take this time to reflect on your role and your position. Think about your own personal identity and those aspects of diversity that can be marginalized in society, but also can be used to serve as your why for the work that you do, and used to really connect with the clients that you have to serve as that bridge between the systems that they are operating within. Any common strategies that you use to help clients cope with racial stressors. So if you're currently a student or intern, if you're currently, I know China was a postdoc, if there are any other postdocs that are working with students or working with clients to cope with racial stressors, share those strategies and resources. And then any questions that you bring to today, drop them in the chat, and certainly throughout today's discussion or presentation, please continue adding those questions. In our understanding of interpersonal stressors, hopefully if you are providing any sort of clinical care, you are doing so with a trauma-informed approach. That is to say that if you're working with kiddos, you do understand that many of these kiddos, data will say up to 60% of them are experiencing it or witnessing at least one stressful event. Oftentimes we refer to these as adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, but these are those stressful events that are potentially traumatic. There's a subset of our population that is at increased risk for experiencing what we call polyvictimization. So that's 15% of youth who can experience up to 6 stressful events. And this is within 1 year. These stressful events are things like sexual assault, witnessing domestic violence. If you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, we can see that these numbers are likely increasing, right? So unexpected loss of a family member, change in employment or housing. I just talked about a civil war that took place in Sierra Leone, but we can think about the Congo, we can think about Gaza, we can think about ongoing acts of genocide and war that are taking place and the ways in which those are serving as stressors for kiddos, even here domestically. In terms of those ACEs or potentially traumatic experiences, we do know that they impact what we refer to as the cognitive and behavioral triangle. So they impact the way that we think, the emotions that we have, and the ways that we act. For example, if you are a kiddo who's experiencing ongoing physical or emotional abuse, and again, you can replace that stressor with any of the other stressors on the previous slide, it is likely that you also are developing inaccurate thoughts. So things like nobody loves me or I'm worthless, or if you have a caregiver who's hitting you when they're upset, you might also get the inaccurate thought that if you're upset with someone, you hit them. These are related to harmful or negative emotions like impacts to your self-esteem, diminished self-worth, lowered confidence. Additionally, if you have a caregiver who's not regulating their emotions when they're upset, if they're not getting down to eye level and providing opportunities for kiddos to regulate their emotions, these kiddos are also those clients who teachers might report that something happens at 8 a.m. and they're upset until later that day. Or something small happens and there is a huge explosion and they have problems controlling their emotions. In addition, these inaccurate thoughts, these problems controlling our emotions or regulating our emotions also are associated with increased deviance, delinquency, perpetrating violence, otherwise risky behaviors that again are a result or can be a result of those ongoing experiences with trauma. It's important when we think about Black youth to know that these outcomes, these negative thoughts, these harmful feelings, these risky behaviors are also associated with more detrimental consequences, more severe consequences. So a Black kiddo is more likely to get expelled for violence in the classroom as a result of hitting someone when they're upset and problems with emotion regulation than their white American counterparts, for example. Internalizing problems are those problems that often go overlooked with Black kiddos. These are problems that perhaps are less disruptive in communities and families. These are things like depression, anxiety, anger, low self-esteem, self-harm. Externalizing problems are things like aggression, noncompliance, oppositional behavior, substance use, behavioral withdrawal, academic disengagement, for example, that are also a result of, or also can be a result of these experiences with adverse childhood encounters. So this is to say, if you get a kiddo who comes in to see you in session and they are aggressive or they are depressed, it's not only important to assess for using the BASC, right, these internalizing and externalizing problems, for example, but it's also important to, for example, use measures like the UCLA that will allow you to assess for those adverse childhood experiences that are potentially traumatic. When it comes to racial stressors, we also know that Black youth are more likely to experience these dangerous or frightening race-based experiences that do overwhelm our coping capacity and also lead to hopelessness, horror, sadness, anxiety, these negative outcomes that were associated with those ACEs. In terms of epidemiology and incidence, recent data does show that Black youth and other ethnically minoritized adults and children as young as 8 are experiencing on average 5 daily encounters with racial stressors. Up to 90% are reporting experiencing racial stressors each week. So this is on top of those incidences of adverse childhood experiences. These instances of racial stressors can be individual or they can be collective experiences. So just like interpersonal stressors can be individual, this can be community violence, for example. It could be collective if you think about school shootings, right? So interpersonally, we can experience racism as well. And collectively, we can experience racism. So for example, the supermarket shootings or when Dylan Rue shot up Emmanuel A&E, that's an example of collective or community-based trauma. And as it's referred to as community-based trauma, that can be directly encountered as well as vicariously experienced. So vicariously just means witnessed or watched through some other means. That could be face-to-face or online or in social media or in the news, for example. I'll pause here really quickly just to say that all of the vocabulary that you see with this is a cartoon character on the screen. I'm not going to attend to it just for the sake of time, But one of our resources, it's called the Care Package for Racial Healing. I'll orient you to it at the end of this presentation. It contains all of this psychoeducation and this vocabulary for you to use in handouts with your clients. So this slide has a trigger warning. Most of my visuals were designed by research participants and a graphic designer. This is the one slide that has real world images. And it is to depict the range of racial stressors that Black youth do encounter. So first is internalized racism. These are things like corporal punishment, which you see on the screen, which is used by Black caregivers in some cases to thwart the potential consequences that Black youth will experience in society for noncompliance. We know that some caregivers are engaging in corporal punishment for these reasons in response to societal racism, but we also know that Black caregivers aren't the only ones spanking their kiddos. So it's important for us to be aware of those systemic injustices or systemic biases that lead to them being more likely to get their kiddos taken away or to be reported for spanking their kiddos. And these are, again, forms of internalized racism that does lead to corporal punishment or some of these practices. Other forms of internalized racism are things like colorism, for example. Microaggressions are a form of interpersonal racism, so they happen in between people, but they are kind of ambiguous day-to-day momentary slights that can be ridiculed, dismissed, denied, or the recipient can be told that they're too sensitive or overreacting, for example. These are more ambiguous forms of individual racism. Individual racism can impact kiddos or your clients in school, in their community. These are interpersonally mediated forms of racism. That also, if you imagine what's depicted on the screen, is a supervision meeting, for example. Individual racism can take place behind the scenes clinically, for example, when conceptualizing clients, and implicit biases that clinicians have can also impact the clinical care that clients are receiving. If we think about kiddos in the school system, this could be a 504 meeting, for example, and individual racism or implicit biases can be taking place. And in this case, it's important to have clinicians and advocates and allies at these meetings and on these teams so that these kiddos have someone who is aware of their cultural difficulties, aware of the biases that they're likely encountering in their school systems, in society, to help them navigate. This is Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper. These are examples of individual racism that can take place in the community. So Amy Cooper said that she was going to call the police and say that a Black man was trying to kill her. And he asked her just to put her dogs on a leash. These forms of individual racism, if witnessed by someone else, are also vicarious racism. So this is Armand Arbery, Breonna Taylor. These are recent examples of vicarious racism that kiddos will tell you they're familiar with just due to social media, the news, their friends in their neighborhoods, for example. Kids are saying, I know about Mike Brown, I know about Trayvon Martin, I know about Philando Castile. This can happen to me because I look like them. And those do lead to what we'll see shortly, the same sorts of detrimental outcomes. So environmental racism are things like Confederate statues and Confederate flags, but it's also things like redlining and zoning that leads to unequitable distribution of resources and social services, for example, that also impacts the kiddos that we're seeing. Institutionally, I mentioned special ed, but we can also think about dress codes, for example, that lead to discrimination, that lead to unfair discipline. What you see on the screen here is the mass incarceration of Black families. So the justice system, juvenile justice system, for example, social services are separate institutions that do impact our kiddos. And as these institutions interrelate, they are now impacted by systemic or structural racism. For example, these are those clients who say, I've experienced racism at school. You're part of the mental health system. You guys are interacting. Structural racism can take place in forms of caregivers who say, we don't talk to mental health professionals because you're part of that system, the medical system. And historically, we know about the syphilis study and the Tuskegee experiment, and there's that historical systemic mistrust that could lead caregivers out of receiving services as well. And those values, as they're passed down, so for example, what happens in the family stays in the family, lead to disengagement, for example, from service professionals and certainly from mental health care, right? When you are expected to be vulnerable and to talk about your thoughts and your innermost feelings and emotions. In terms of mental health care behaviorally, we also, if we think about behavioral activation, have been telling our clients long before the Black Lives Matter movement to engage civically, to respond to racism in a way that also can help eradicate it or lead to some sort of positive change. At the same token, we've been telling our clients for just as long to make sure that they wear face masks to these rallies and even these peaceful protests, because we know that they're more likely to face violence in response to racial injustices than they are to, for example, a breast cancer rally. We can see some of those acts of violence taking place now as universities even are responding to protesters in response to the war and the genocide in Gaza. So it's important that we consider these many forms of racism and the ways in which they are impacting our kiddos as they're coming to see us to deal with interpersonal stressors and to deal with those outcomes that are related to these ongoing experiences with racism. So for the sake of time, I actually won't spend much time on this slide just because you guys should trust that I know what I'm talking about. These are the 4 types of racism that you can use the care package to provide psychoeducation on if you are talking to your clients about the types of racism that they encounter. As you'll see from the vocabulary on the screen, it is important to, as you are providing that psychoeducation, also talk to your clients about examples that they can identify in their everyday lives. This is a form of gradual exposure for your clients, but it's also a way for bi-directional learning, and it's a way for them to better engage with those materials. We know that racial stressors do lead to internal dilemmas. So questions like, should I say something or do something? If I do, will it make it worse? Will I be told that I'm overreacting? Did I even hear that right or interpret that correctly? Certainly, there's nothing I can do to control that. If you see the speed with which I had these internal thoughts that I just said these, right? If we think about these over and over, that starts to sound like and feel like what? That's rumination, right? Clinically, we know that that leads to or is associated with, is a symptom of anxiety. Psychologically, racial stressors also lead to depression as a result of hopelessness, helplessness, sleep difficulties, as distinguished by diminished confidence, those problems with self-esteem that we talked about, loss of drive, diminished concentration or ability to perform in school, a lack of willingness to engage, intrusive thoughts, suicidality as well. It's important to know that the ways in which racism is potentially traumatic is very similar to the ways in which interpersonal stressors, physical abuse, sexual assault, are potentially traumatic for its victims. These events are unpredictable. You don't know when racism is coming. Certainly you can't control the color of your skin. In the case of microaggressions, implicit biases, and subtle acts, even misdiagnoses, right, that occur as a result of validated measures, perhaps aren't reliable. We know that these diagnoses, that these microaggressions, that these subtle acts can be worse than overt acts. You can back them up with data in some cases. You can challenge people's experiences. You can ridicule their reactions. And certainly you can dismiss any concerns or any consequences that are a result of it just by the nature of racism being associated with privilege and power in society. As we know that interpersonal stressors can lead to PTSD, we also know that racial stressors can lead to what we refer to as racial trauma. Clinically, we're not yet able to diagnose racial trauma. We're still doing that fight with psychology, but we can diagnose PTSD. We can label that incident trauma as racism or a racial stressor. So that incident trauma can be experienced directly or vicariously. And we know that it can be associated with the first symptom criteria of PTSD being re-experiencing. So these are kiddos who say, I'm having flashbacks. I keep seeing George Floyd. I keep hearing Philando Castile. These are kiddos who are reporting discrimination in higher numbers. Arousal and reactivity, we often call this hypervigilance. So this is being irritable. This is being aggressive. This is having an exaggerated startle response. For example, we have kiddos who, if they're experiencing interpersonal stressors, if they're getting physically abused at home, you might notice that they flinch if an adult reaches towards them. Kiddos who are experiencing racial stressors might flinch, perhaps because they think someone's going to touch their hair without asking. That's a microaggression. It's a microinvalidation. That hypervigilance can be seen behaviorally in this case, but in other cases, it might be seen in the form of noncompliance or being startled by a command or a resource officer or a police officer. Being triggered is an example of hyperreactivity. Negative emotions. So these are things like reduced interest. I'm no longer interested in school because every time I raise my hand, I'm not called on. I'm no longer interested in college because I got asked how I even got accepted into an honors class. I'm detached from voting and civic engagement because the laws and the police don't protect and serve me in the ways that they should. Detachment, loss of pleasure, and behavioral avoidance of people, places, things, potential triggers. Avoiding police officers, avoiding school, skipping class due to racism. So the question clinically becomes, do we have an antisocial, disengaged, angry, avoidant kid, or do we have a kiddo who needs some help navigating racial stressors? I say need some help navigating racial stressors because we do know that oftentimes families are already contending with racism and they're already socializing their kids in a way that will help them combat it. So the work that we do clinically is to take a strengths-based approach and to understand that most families are already having these conversations around socialization and race. So socialization in general is how we raise our kiddos to say, you look both ways before you cross the street, you say please and thank you, you navigate society by not littering, putting away your shopping cart. They have the birds and the bees conversation to navigate condom use and self-esteem and picking healthy partners. Racial socialization is much the same process, but it's how we transmit the behaviors and the values and the rules of our race and our ethnic group, and how we navigate those stressors that are associated with the fact that Black folks are marginalized in society. Racial socialization is in direct opposition to racism, and it is linked to improved outcomes that are also in opposition to racism. So these are things like improved self-esteem, increased and more positive racial identity, so more positive thoughts about yourself and your ability to navigate society, as well as more positive thoughts about the centrality of your identity. Academic and job performance is shown to improve, as well as engagement across academic tasks, psychological resilience, parent-child interactions, emotional coping, and decision-making. We convey racial socialization through oral communication, modeling, role-playing, exposing youth to positive figures, for example. We know that there are 6 main types of racial socialization messages, the first being racial pride messages. So these are made to combat negative messages that a child receives. It's also made to or designed to overcome a lack of representation. So if a kiddo is scrolling down social media and they see negative images of Black people, they're able to, through having received racial pride messages, combat those with more positive images and in turn not internalize those negative messages. Racial barrier messages are those that prepare kiddos for and provide those skills that allow them to cope with and heal from experiences with racism. So how do you respond if you get pulled over by the police? This is a common conversation that Black families are having in order to prepare them for those potential encounters. Racial achievement messages focus on the need to work twice as hard as other groups to be rewarded the same. We are supplementing these messages with relaxation messages that say, as we're working twice as hard, we have to relax and restore twice as much. Spirituality and religious messages are those that promote strength and healing and support through a higher power. Clinically, if you're talking to a client who has spiritual beliefs and is highly religious, it's important to know that so that you can align your clinical services with those beliefs. For example, if a client believes that faith without works is dead, or God helps those who help themselves, you're able to integrate that in the work that you're doing. Or if you're talking about mindfulness and meditation, but your client buys into prayer and giving thanks, you can make the connection with them. Extended family involvement emphasizes the importance of others in child rearing. So it takes a village to raise a kid. This is to say that if you're doing child treatment, you're doing child and family treatment. This is to say if you're doing child and family treatment, it's not just the nuclear family, but it's also that extended family. The play cousins, the big mamas. For me, it was Candy Lady down the street. So who can be that tangible support for your kiddos? Who can share in those experiences? Who can provide those coping skills and help them practice? And racial equality messages are those that we utilize to help our clients approach rather than avoid when racism would otherwise have them isolated. So these are messages that emphasize that all races are equal and should celebrate their differences and live together peacefully. So if you have a kiddo who's behaviorally withdrawn or who has these negative emotions associated with other ethnic groups due to their experiences with racism, you can help combat that by knowing about their values early on. So really quickly, actually, I'm not going to talk about any of my research methods. I'm just going to talk to you guys about the results, but I will, again, give you access to these readings. In general, we know that Black youth are more likely to experience trauma, to experience racism, to suffer disproportionate and more severe consequences, but they are more likely also to utilize these cultural strengths in the form of racial socialization. These Black youth are also less likely to initiate mental health treatment, to complete mental health treatment, to report positive outcomes over time, or to sustain those at follow-up. So given that, we do emphasize the importance of highlighting culturally specific risk processes, so integrating the understanding of racism as a risk factor into trauma treatment, as well as integrating those culturally specific protective processes. So utilizing those innate strengths and those familiar strengths in the form of racial socialization is what allows for truly comprehensive work. And also it allows us to overcome barriers to treatment. So I want to talk about my program of research and to take a pit stop as we really quickly discuss those potential barriers to treatment. So the basic research that I conduct is really just to say that racism hurts and that racial socialization works. It's also to show the benefit of integrating racial socialization and racial discrimination into trauma treatment. But through that, we have to look at community-based organizations and really identify those targets that we can shape to make services more accessible for Black youth and families. Because if we have these treatments and they're not using them or they're not working for them, what's the benefit? Particularly if they can't even access them. That third pillar of my research is to, once we've made services more accessible and relevant, to really translate those treatments to be more culturally informed and culturally adapted. So those are the resources that I'm going to share with you all today, are a result of that translational research, as well as some public health work that I've recently started doing to increase substance misuse, HIV, and trauma awareness, testing, screening, and service utilization, so that we can really disseminate the results of this research to that subset of the population who isn't yet treatment seeking or treatment using, and connecting those services for individuals who need them. So with that, I want to take a pit stop, like I said, at this 2023 article entitled Black Moms Matter. Really quickly, let us think about first the setting of this research. So I did this work at children's advocacy centers. There are about 1,000 of them across the nation. They do follow accreditation standards that allow us to really standardize the ways in which they provide care to traumatized youth. And as we standardize those standards across centers, we can assure that staff are trained in the same way, that these multidisciplinary teams are reacting to families and serving them in a really systematic way. So I did a chart review to look at families who were referred to services, look at the age, ethnicity, and other demographic variables of those families, and really see where the trickle down was in the services that were provided at a children's advocacy center between 2015 and 2016. These results weren't surprising. Black clients missed significantly more forensic interview sessions. So these are appointments where police officers are thought to be involved because of the word forensic. Black clients attended significantly fewer treatment sessions, and Black clients were significantly less likely to graduate treatment. So as I said, these results weren't surprising, but we did want to find out from caregivers of referred youth why they did receive those services or why they did not receive those services, what served as barriers to those services. So we did 40-minute interviews with parental caregivers of referred youth to talk to them about the types of services that they were referred to and their experiences. And we did qualitative content analysis to identify with myself and another independent coder different themes that emerged from the caregivers. Once we agreed upon those themes, we established a code book and we were able to identify these barriers and facilitators to treatment, utilization, and initiation. So 87% of caregivers talked about unaffirmative treatment referrals as a barrier to their services. So they said things like, they told me to come to this organization and no one told me why or what sorts of services would be offered. So if I hear the word forensic evaluation, I'm assuming police. Of course, I'm assuming you're taking my kids away. Of course, I'm not showing up. Or an ambiguous investigation. My kiddo came home from school and all of a sudden somebody was knocking on my door asking me questions. This is to say, if you are a clinician, one of the things that you can do to overcome that barrier is just take a look at your client's charts before they come in. And when they do come in for those initial sessions, ask them what questions they have about the referral process, about any previous investigations, and really serve as a bridge between those systems that they're engaged with, whether that be forensics or juvenile justice or even social services or the school system. Caregivers also talked about organizational barriers, so things like hours of operation, proximity to public transportation, and childcare. These can be overcome by offering evening and weekend clinics, offering bus tokens or Lyft credits, or making your clients receive access to the Medicaid van if they can receive those services. Taking volunteers from nearby colleges, doing background checks, hiring them on as interns to provide childcare for other kiddos who weren't receiving services at the time. Clients also talked about barriers within themselves. So stigma, I don't want you calling me a bad mom. I don't want you labeling my kid as having ADHD or conduct disorder. System mistrust. So how do you identify yourself within the system? How do you clarify your role as a mandated reporter to help overcome perhaps some discomfort that your caregivers have asking questions? This research allows for us to do things like making psychoeducation handouts with frequently asked questions about mandated reporting and limits of confidentiality. Simple tools like this have been shown to overcome those barriers to trust, those barriers to even building rapport with your clients, and ultimately having them engage in services. Clients also talked about provider barriers, so a lack of cultural efficacy, misdiagnosis, and implicit biases that can be overcome by doing some of the readings, using some of these resources, attending trainings as providers, making sure that you practice cultural humility. So overall, like I said, these results quantitatively weren't surprising, but qualitatively, we do know that we can provide services that are easier to access. They can be delivered in a way that's representative of the target population and their cultural concerns. And the content can also be culturally appropriate and designed to overcome barriers that exist, like stigma or discomfort asking questions. The translational research that I conduct is what has allowed for that adaptation to TFCBT for Black youth and families. This was done as a part of my postdoctoral and early faculty work, but it has allowed for me to contribute to the body of research that has evaluated and refined TFCBT over the past 25 years. So there have been adaptations for Latinx youth, for youth from sexually and gender diverse backgrounds, for youth in low and middle income countries, for example. So this adaptation is the one that is for Black youth and families. There's a fidelity checklist for those of you who are interested in reading about the development of this adaptation. This is in, I think it's the second or third reading in those recommended readings. But this is the early adaptation of this healing interpersonal and racial trauma work. The more recent work is in the development of that manual as well as the care package, which you guys can access for free. Public health work that I have done has allowed for us to target four hotspot counties in Georgia, but also to disseminate more widely across the nation a public health messaging and awareness campaign. This public health messaging campaign really just talks about the impact of racism. It talks about ways to recognize the signs of racism and cope with racism, how to be an ally or an advocate. And all of the QR codes that even come with these very brief reminders of coping skills lead back to a much larger racial trauma guide that viewers of the public health messaging campaign can utilize to get more resources and information about racism and how to heal from and hopefully eradicate racism, which is our ultimate goal. So this is what they look like in yard sign form as well as in the top middle poster form. If you are interested in this, like I said, we have funding from SAMHSA that allows us to send you a yard sign or a poster or as many as you want completely for free as you are viewing this information. Let me do a time check. Great. So 4 quick strategies and then a whole bunch of resources for you guys. So the first thing that I want to emphasize when discussing racial stress and trauma is that there are a lot of apprehensions and potential pitfalls that are likely coming to mind as you are practicing clinicians, whether or not you started having these conversations. And truly, the biggest pitfall is not having these conversations and not doing comprehensive assessments and not doing comprehensive work. So the first resource that I want to share is that resource that will allow clients to be more comfortable having conversations with you in session. So these are resources that we have around limits of confidentiality and mandated reporting that if you reach out, we can make, we can tailor to the state of Washington as well. These are validated measures that exist to assess for racial stress and trauma. They also assess for racial socialization and racial identity, which are positive results of racial socialization. We also assess for racial stressors by doing an informal or clinical assessment of their first, worst, and last experiences with racism. These, as you can see, this, we call it the virtual companion, but this is a companion that's available for you to use in the care package to help your clients walk through these conversations. TFCBT, if you were utilizing it, does follow a model called practice. We don't have the time to emphasize each of these components, but just to show you the resources that accompany these components through the TFCBT adaptation, so that translational research is first a psychoeducation, which allows you to normalize and discuss and learn about racism, racial socialization, and racial identity. So everything that I presented at the beginning of today's presentation is a form of psychoeducation that you can deliver with your clients through not going through the presentation like I just did, but through using some of our resources and our handouts. So this is an example of psychoeducation on racial trauma that talks about the symptoms of racial trauma and how to cope. We also have additional psychoeducation. Again, the QR code is all going to lead back to the very same racial trauma guide, but this allows you to really make personal the different types of psychoeducation that you're providing. And that's based on the developmental age of your clients. We also provide psychoeducation in order to normalize their reactions to racism. So we want to validate their responses, even if they are having fight responses, flight, freeze, and fawn responses. We normalize and validate even angry outbursts and noncompliance before we go on to intervening on them clinically. We have online resources around racial socialization that talk about the different types of racial socialization messages and ways that caregivers can practice racial socialization with their kiddos. So these are things that you can discuss very briefly in session and just give to your clients as homework assignments or even in vivo activities. Relaxation, as mentioned, we utilize relaxation to cope with stress and to combat that need that we have to work twice as hard in society. So we, with our clients, we build their relaxation toolkit, and we make sure that we are adding into their toolkit different things that they can do to relax across settings. So at school, at home, or on the internet, in the car. No matter what you're doing for relaxation, it's suggested that you integrate progressive muscle relaxation into the practices that you are referring or recommending for your clients to utilize. We have a script available for you. We have handouts. This is one version of the handout. We got some feedback and we created a more boy-friendly version of this handout. And we also have a full script of the PMR activity and exercise that you can work through with your clients. Affective modulation is just really important to identify and communicate the feelings associated with racism so that your clients can advocate for themselves, so that they can express the emotions that they're experiencing. For example, distinguishing between anger and passion for a client who's talking with their hands, for example, is what oftentimes allows for an individual to listen to and help advocate for and really protect a client who is responding to racism and their emotions of perhaps anger or frustration, or like I said, passion. So we allow clients just to list all the emotions that they can feel, all the emotions that they are used to experiencing, and then we ask them to talk about those emotions in the context of race and racial stressors. So what's or a time that you felt angry in relation to your race, or a time that you felt proud or happy in relation to your race. And that allows for them to really get that range of emotions and start to understand how to communicate and advocate for themselves. Cognitive restructuring is what most clinicians want to do, right? So we want to get to the point where we can ask our clients, how else could you have done this better? Or how else can you think about that? You want to get to the fixing point. Our job as it pertains to racism and racial stressors is to identify those inaccurate thoughts, those harmful feelings, those negative and potentially dangerous behaviors, and to realize that racism is what causes them. And not to restructure our experience of racism, but to restructure our response to be more proactive and value-based. And we do this through a process called BLACK. BLACK allows us to pause in the moment, to think about what we are feeling, and to ask and communicate in a way that allows us to advocate for ourselves. We can ask follow-up questions about what we're feeling, how others might interpret the event, and we problem solve in a way that allows us to really advocate for ourselves in the moment. But this is a skill that you can teach your clients so that they can restructure and reframe their initial responses to racism. So really quickly, I'm going to go through these examples. First being a part of a group project and not getting acknowledged. You can think that you didn't do well on the project and that the performance is a result of, or the grade is a result of your performance. That leads to feelings of embarrassment, anger, and hurt, and can lead to disengagement. So speaking up less, not volunteering for group projects, disengaging from class. The process of BLACK allows you to ask those clarifying questions about the other students in the class. If it happens to other students, or if it's just you, if it happens often, how many other students are there? What sorts of emotions does it make you feel? What have you tried to do? How did that work? Who can you talk to this about? And you're able to go through this process and understand that, wait, it's not a result of my experiences or my contribution. It's a result of racism. You can feel more determined, more confident, more proud. And as a result, instead of disengaging, now you're approaching. You're asking your teacher for feedback. You're sending a reminder of your contribution. Maybe you're getting a classmate who saw your contribution advocate on your behalf. Getting pulled over by the police is another example. I'm going a little quicker because I want to be able to have a little time for questions and discussion. Seeing this happen on the news, I'm definitely going to die and get shot. This can lead to anxiety, fear, and anger, acting out of character. But if you think about what it is that's making the client worry, if you get them to talk through how they prepared as a family, how else they can talk to themselves, what else they can do, what else you've talked about in session, now they know that there's heightened racial tension, but they feel more prepared. They're more calm and controlled. They have their hands at 10 and 2 because that's what you guys have talked about in session and as a family. And they're able to practice PMR in the back seat, which allows them to calm down their body's physiological responses to this stressful encounter. Other resources that we have are around cognitive restructuring and identifying those alter egos or those thinking traps that clients often fall into. So we help them identify these alter egos and challenge them in a way that's more realistic and more positive. Those were the whirlwind example of the PRAC components. As I mentioned, this is a part of the overall practice components that TFCBT follows. We do have, like I said, a ton of resources. If you want to get trained in TFCBT, you can go to our website at tfcbt2.musc.edu. Our racial trauma guide is also one that I want to orient you all to. And then that racial socialization and TFCBT article, again, is either the second or the third reading on your list. This is the racial trauma guide that I keep talking about. It looks a little differently because we updated our website, but it does have these sections and resources around coping with racial trauma, talking about kids, or talking about racism with kids, being a better ally, talking about race in white families. The care package. So all that vocabulary that I mentioned, this is in a care package that you can download also for free. If you're doing telehealth, you can just share the screen like this, or If you're doing in-person services, just use the hospital's printer, print out a couple pages at a time, and you can do this psychoeducation with your clients. If you do want to deliver TFCBT, this is the implementation manual for this in terms of using TFCBT with Black families and integrating racial socialization into that work as you help them also overcome racial stressors. We have a ton of resources. You guys have seen the first two. The second two are actually also on Seattle Children's website. So this is work that I did in consultation with Nat and with China. This is actually one of what I will say is our most popular resources, in that it has this script that clinicians can utilize. So if you want to utilize any actual vocabulary to talk through with your clients and get practice on having these conversations early on in session, it's a really great one that just talks about the different types of diversity that your clients might identify with, as well as different forms of discrimination that they might experience. And you can talk about your identity as a clinician and how you might encounter some pitfalls, but you do want to align with your clients to help overcome those. We also have additional resources. These first two are from, or maybe the first three as well, yes, are from the work with FAST as well. So these are psychoeducation for teens and for kids and teens. If you think about the common conversation that we're having with our kiddos about police violence, we have resources around that as well, talking about police brutality, progressive muscle relaxation, racial identity. Let me just click through these. Go to draishamesker.com/online resources, and you can literally just pick what you want to focus on with your clients. If you have a session focused on racial socialization, for example, we have a ton of resources around that. Scroll to the bottom of this resources tab, and there are additional resources, readings, podcasts, online videos, books for kids and teens that you can utilize as clinicians and researchers yourselves, but also that you can make clients aware of. I gave you access to 16 readings. If you want more, go to draishamesker.com/research, and there's a whole list of all my articles and publications. If you want the brief versions of that, follow us on Instagram, @theempowerlab, where you can, I said @theempowerlab, the Empower Lab, and you can get video demonstrations of our PMR. You can get activities of us responding to microaggressions. Just join in on the conversation about best ways to heal from racism. If you're not tired of hearing me talk, I do have a podcast called Black and Empowered Podcast. This is available everywhere you get podcasts. We talk about Black excellence. We talk about research around racism and racial socialization as well. And like I said, I did get some money for this work. I really do want to thank my research participants, my graphic designers, and my research assistants. So these are my grad students in 2020, Racial Trauma Task Force in 2021. We had a pool party in 2022. I should update this. And here's how you can get in contact with me. We are now going to pause for the chat and any questions that came up. Everyone order one, yes. Order a public health campaign slide. China, you have a question?
Yeah, I don't know if Michelle or Carol, if you all are, I didn't put this question in the chat, but one of the things that, well, first let me pause and say, hearing you speak and learning from you is just always an inspiration, and this is going to fuel my soul for the next month. So thank you for that. One of the things that Rochelle and I came up against in the racial stress and coping group that we started was Black teens that would say, "Oh, I don't experience racism." And it was interesting. It was something that I did not prepare for. Because it felt so obvious to me in these ways in which racism is systemic in our society, that teens would just acknowledge that. And so I'm wondering and we did some work and got there eventually, but I'm wondering if you have anything to share, particularly with clinicians who might engage in this work and who are not Black or African descendants, that might be helpful in when they receive that statement from a kiddo.
Yeah, I always find that interesting in that I think it's a very common experience to be submerged in something and unaware, right? So there's a common saying, if you ask a fish what it's like to be like in water, they'll never say that it's wet, right? So if you ask a kid about racism, they're going to say, no, it's just my day-to-day life. I don't experience racism. And in those cases, I do think that just having conversations around internalized racism, internal or environmental racism, talking to them about the different types of racism. So maybe you're not encountering interpersonal racism in the form of white supremacy and racial slurs, but maybe you are experiencing some unequitable distribution of resources that is impacting you. Or maybe there are some unfair disciplinary practices that have been impacting you on school grounds. So providing that comprehensive psychoeducation is very different than just asking the question, does racism impact you? Once you provide that psychoeducation, oftentimes you get the light bulb go off and then the kiddos will start to give their own examples. But it's also, we call it rolling with resistance, right? So if you go through all the psychoeducation and the kiddo says, yeah, no, I'm not encountering this at all, you can roll with that resistance, provide the psychoeducation, and then just continue with doing the check-in. So if something happens on the news or on social media, you can say, this is something that happened recently. I'm wondering if you saw it, if it's affecting you, and you can respond accordingly. But it does happen, certainly depending on the social location of the kiddo, depending on the developmental age, and even their awareness and prior exposure to these sorts of conversations, where some kids just aren't yet aware until that psychoeducation occurs. I think the question that follows that typically is, do I want to make them aware of something that's not impacting them, and will that make it worse? And my answer is yes. Even that vocabulary and that awareness and that understanding of will allow them to respond more favorably and to prepare for future instances that they're likely encounter. So it doesn't hurt to provide that education. It doesn't traumatize, but it can make them aware of and give them the coping skills that accompany that awareness. Thank you for that question. Any others? Let me scroll. I did respond to one of the comments in the chat about the cognitive restructuring identity. So I showed the one handout that labels each of them. We have subsequent handouts that provide examples of reframes and then fill in the blanks so kids can start to work through those cognitive distortions and ways to really combat them or make them more accurate or slightly more positive.
I just want to comment on how impressive it is that you're providing all these resources and freely giving them out and sharing them and encouraging people to use them. I think that's a great example of doing good in the world, as well as your public health messaging. And, so just, it's not a question, but maybe the question is sort of, how do you see that as part of your work? And, what you're doing great role modeling for us and others, it seems to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important to not only make the resources available for those who are engaged in clinical services, but also to make them available for those who aren't receiving clinical services. And when I say available, I don't mean available for purchase, right? I think that they should be freely available. I do think that a part of the work that I do is to empower clinicians and to best help kiddos. So as we know that most kiddos aren't receiving those services, how can we just get them in their hands, even if they're not? And with clinicians, right? How can we support the work that you're doing? Because one handout can be an hour of a conversation that is helping to summarize. So thank you for saying that. Hopefully those of you who haven't yet felt comfortable, but have really felt eager to have these conversations will start to feel more empowered and have the support and the guidance to have those. And certainly you guys have some people in-house who have been thinking about this for a long, long time and who have been doing this work. And what I'll say, you see how quickly I had to go through that practice? Practice takes a long time. Use FAST because it goes faster. And it is based on the same evidence base. And if you're interested, talk to China about some of the work that she's doing with group implementation, right? So if we're thinking about being able to amplify the impact of this work individually, group basis, for the public, if you're a researcher, if you're someone else who has a position, again, think about different modalities, different delivery methods, and the ways that you also can help increase the impact of using and even creating additional resources. You guys are welcome. Okay, so there are no questions in the chat. What I'm gonna say, on the screen is my contact information. I really want you guys to start using these resources. Questions will come up. As they do, reach out, whether that be through my website, through social media, shoot me an email. I do want to continue supporting you guys in this work. I'm glad to see that you're enthusiastic about it. And Nat in China, sorry I just made you publicly available, but it was like 120 people in here. So utilize any of us, I'll say.
We do have one question in the chat. If we've got time for one more question, what do you think, Carol? Okay, great. Do you have any tips for primary care providers on helping families be willing to access mental health resources?
Ooh, I had a really good answer until I saw the word willing. So that word willing is to say, so the quick answer I was going to say is just give them the handouts and let them use them between, right? So you don't have to take up your quick appointment times. But that willingness is all going to be about that connection that you're able to make. So definitely, if you use that yellow all about you handout, have that conversation really quickly early on. And then I think that initial buy-in will allow for that continued conversation. They'll have that, they'll be empowered, right? They'll have that willingness to go utilize the resources on their own. So have those early conversations and then just open the world up for them. A lot of times just saying, here's a handout, read this handout. They scan that QR code and now the world is open. So what I'll say is use the limited time that you have to connect as much as possible and make them aware of and just get them started using the resources. Others of our handouts, right? We have like 20 suggestions on a page and we always say, just try to pick one or two, right? So that's something that you can do with the willingness because it can be potentially overwhelming. Racism is a huge thing, right? To talk about it is a huge thing. So pace yourselves, take one or two tips, continue the conversation over time. The same thing I'm saying to you guys as clinicians and practitioners. Oh, that was a Nat question. That's so funny. Yes. Thank you, Anna. MCC. Oh, Anna, that's for China. Yay, China. I don't see your face anymore. But Anna has a question about group facilitation. So China should be able to help answer that, but you can definitely reach out to me as well. But China just finished, I think, her third group. Right there in-house, you guys.
Well, I actually think this comment from Christine Clancy, you are a brilliant force. Your work is amazing. Keep it up and thank you for presenting is a really nice wrap up. And thank you for your work and for your presentation today.
Thank you guys for your work. Keep it up. Oh, I keep thinking they're questions. You guys are great. Thanks for all the kudos. Please, please, please use the resources. You're welcome. You're welcome. Y'all are so cute. Thank you guys.
Thank you.